There are people who enter your life like storms, loud, controlling, and convincing you that your peace must be negotiated with their chaos. They test your patience, bend your emotions, and slowly try to make you believe that reacting to them is the only way to stay connected to them. But there comes a turning point, a quiet awakening, when you realize something powerful. You were never meant to wrestle with storms. You were meant to rise above them. And in that rising, something within you changes so deeply that even those who once tried to control you begin to see you differently, almost as if for the first time. Some people do not enter your life to understand you, but to extract something from you. They learn, sometimes without even realizing it consciously, that your reactions are a kind of fuel for them. Your anger gives them control. Your sadness gives them importance. Your explanations give them attention. And so they keep pressing the same emotional buttons, not because they seek truth, but because they seek a response that confirms their influence over you. In such dynamics, what is being tested is not your patience alone, but your awareness of what you are giving away without even noticing. There comes a moment, however, when something shifts inside you. You begin to see the pattern rather than the performance. You start noticing that every reaction you give is not bringing resolution, but repetition. And slowly, almost silently, you begin to withdraw the one thing they have always relied on, your emotional availability. You no longer rush to defend every misunderstanding. You no longer explain yourself into exhaustion. You no longer pour your energy into proving your worth to someone committed to misunderstanding it. In that withdrawal, something unexpected happens. The space you once filled with reaction becomes empty, and that emptiness begins to speak louder than words ever did. Where there was once emotional chaos, there is now stillness. Where there was once tension, there is now distance. And in that distance, the dynamic begins to lose its shape, because influence that depends on reaction cannot survive in silence for long. It begins to weaken, not through confrontation, but through absence. It is not that you become cold or indifferent in a cruel sense. It is that you become selective with your energy. You begin to understand that not every action deserves a response, and not every provocation deserves your attention. This is where strength quietly takes root, not in shouting louder, not in proving more, but in choosing not to engage where engagement only drains your spirit. And those who once thrived on your emotional responses begin to feel something unfamiliar. They are no longer able to predict you. They are no longer able to pull you into the same emotional cycles. The access they once had to your reactions is no longer open in the same way. And in that unfamiliarity, their control over the situation starts to dissolve, because control was never truly about power, it was about predictability. What replaces it is not fear, but confusion, and eventually recognition. A recognition that you are no longer operating from the same place you once were. You are no longer easily moved. You are no longer easily disturbed. And without needing to declare anything, you have already changed the entire structure of the interaction simply by no longer participating in what once drained you. And in that change, something profound becomes visible. When you stop feeding emotional chaos, it stops growing around you. The moment you stop reacting, something subtle but irreversible begins to happen within you. At first, it feels almost unnatural, as if you are breaking a habit that once defined how you survived certain people and situations. You are used to responding quickly, defending yourself, explaining yourself, proving your intentions, and trying to correct what others deliberately misunderstood. But when you pause instead of react, you begin to notice something you were too emotionally involved to see before. You were not always speaking from power. Sometimes you were speaking from pressure. In that pause, your voice begins to return to you, not the voice that is loud or defensive, but the voice that is clear and steady, the kind of voice that does not rush to be accepted because it is already grounded in its own truth. You start realizing that every reaction you once gave away so freely was also a small surrender of your inner space, And now, by choosing not to react, you are slowly gathering that space back piece by piece. There is a quiet transformation that takes place when you no longer feel the need to explain yourself to those committed to misunderstanding you. You begin to see that explanation, when overused, becomes exhaustion. And exhaustion is not where truth thrives. Truth thrives in calmness, in clarity, in a presence that does not shake every time someone else tries to disturb it. So you begin to speak less, but what you say starts to carry more weight. You begin to respond only when necessary, and even then, your words no longer carry the urgency they once did. This is where self-respect quietly rebuilds itself, not in dramatic moments, but in the small decision to stay silent when silence protects your peace better than words ever could. And in that silence, something powerful is reflected back to you. People who once depended on your reactions begin to realize they can no longer access you in the same way, not because you have changed who you are, but because you have changed what you allow. And this is often misunderstood by those who are used to emotional control. They may interpret your calmness as distance, your silence as defeat, or your boundaries as rejection. But what they do not see is that you are no longer abandoning yourself just to remain emotionally available to confusion. You are no longer offering your voice as a place for chaos to settle. The reclaiming of your voice does not mean becoming louder. It means becoming intentional. It means that when you speak, you are no longer trying to win emotional battles. You are simply stating truth without apology. And when you choose not to speak, it is not because you have nothing to say, but because you have finally learned that not everything deserves your energy. In this space, you begin to understand something deeply liberating. Your voice was never lost. It was only buried under the weight of unnecessary reactions. And now, in the quiet discipline of restraint, it rises again, stronger, clearer, and no longer easy to take away. Silence is often misunderstood by those who are uncomfortable with it. To them, silence looks like absence, like surrender, like something unfinished or unresolved. But silence, when chosen with awareness, is none of these things. It is not the absence of strength. It is the presence of control. It is the moment where emotion is no longer driving the response and wisdom begins to take its place. In that space, nothing is being lost. Instead, something far more valuable is being preserved. When you learn to remain silent in situations where you once would have reacted, you begin to notice the difference between impulse and intention. Impulse speaks quickly, often before understanding has fully formed. Intention waits, it listens, it observes. And in that observation, silence becomes not empty, but full of awareness, full of restraint, full of dignity that does not need to announce itself to be real. There are moments in life where speaking more would only create confusion, not clarity. And in those moments, silence becomes a form of clarity itself. It allows you to step back from emotional noise and see things as they are, not as they are being projected onto you. This is where discipline quietly enters the picture, because silence is not always easy. It requires control over the urge to defend, the urge to correct, and the urge to be understood immediately. That control is not weakness, it is refinement. And as you practice this restraint, something begins to change in the way others perceive you. Those who once expected immediate reactions from you start to realize that access to your emotions is no longer automatic. They can no longer predict your responses or pull you into cycles that once drained you. This shift is not created through confrontation, but through consistency, through the steady choice not to engage where engagement only diminishes your peace. What many fail to understand is that silence is not passive. It is active self-respect. It is the decision to value your inner stability more than external validation. It is choosing not to spill your energy into spaces that do not honor it. And in doing so, you begin to protect something that is often overlooked in moments of emotional turbulence: your sense of self. Over time, silence begins to reshape your presence. You no longer feel the need to fill every gap with explanation or justification. You no longer feel responsible for correcting every misunderstanding placed upon you. Instead, you allow truth to stand on its own, without forcing it into places that are not ready to receive it. This is where discipline becomes visible, not in how loudly you respond, but in how deliberately you choose not to. And within that discipline, dignity takes form. Not the kind of dignity that demands recognition, but the kind that exists whether it is acknowledged or not. It is steady, it is composed. It does not bend easily under pressure because it is not built on reaction. It is built on awareness. And once you understand this, silence is no longer something you struggle with. It becomes something you stand in, fully and without apology. A grounded spirit does not need to announce itself, because its strength is not built on comparison or competition. It is built on understanding, an understanding of who you are when no one is clapping, when no one is agreeing, and when no one is trying to test your limits. Loud personalities often rely on volume, urgency, and emotional pressure to dominate a space. But what they often fail to recognize is that calm presence does not compete for space. It simply occupies its own, firmly and quietly. When you are grounded within yourself, the noise around you begins to lose its influence. Words that once would have shaken your emotions start to pass through you without leaving damage. Situations that once demanded immediate reaction now give you enough clarity to pause, reflect, and choose your response instead of being pulled into one. This shift is not about becoming detached from life, but about becoming deeply connected to your own center, so that nothing external can easily pull you away from it. There is a certain freedom in no longer being easily provoked. It means you are no longer living at the mercy of other people's moods, expectations, or emotional volatility. Instead, you begin to operate from a place that is steady, even when everything around you is not. And in that steadiness, something powerful becomes visible to others, even if they cannot fully explain it. Your presence starts to feel different, not louder, but heavier in a calm way, more composed, more intentional. Loud personalities often seek reactions because reactions validate their control. But when they are met with calmness instead of resistance or emotional collapse, their usual patterns begin to lose effectiveness. Not because you are trying to defeat them, but because you are no longer participating in the emotional game they depend on. And in that refusal, the dynamic changes without any need for confrontation. A grounded spirit does not mean you feel nothing. It means you feel deeply, but you are no longer ruled by what you feel in the moment. There is space between emotion and action, and in that space, wisdom begins to speak. That is where true strength lives, not in suppressing emotion, but in understanding it enough to not be controlled by it. Over time, this groundedness reshapes how you are treated. People begin to realize that your silence is not emptiness, your calmness is not weakness, and your restraint is not inability, it is choice. And choice carries a kind of authority that force can never replicate. You are no longer easily drawn into chaos because chaos no longer feels like something you need to respond to in order to prove your presence. And so without needing to argue or overpower, you begin to shift the entire atmosphere around you. Not by becoming louder than others, but by becoming so steady within yourself that external noise no longer decides your direction. There comes a moment in life when you begin to recognize the subtle ways control has been used around you. It is not always loud or obvious. Sometimes it is wrapped in guilt, sometimes in confusion, sometimes in constant shifting of blame that makes you question your own understanding of reality. At first, you may try to respond to it by explaining more, proving more, or adjusting yourself in ways that might bring peace. But over time, you begin to see that control does not end through compliance. It only learns new forms. When you refuse to be controlled, something fundamental shifts in the dynamic. The familiar patterns no longer work the same way. The emotional levers that once triggered reactions begin to lose their effect. This is not because the attempt at manipulation suddenly becomes stronger or weaker, but because your participation in it changes. You stop offering the response that the pattern depends on, and in doing so, you disrupt the entire structure that was built on predictability. At first, this disruption creates discomfort, both within you and around you. Within you, because it challenges the habit of immediate reaction. Around you, because those who relied on certain emotional responses begin to realize that access is no longer automatic. What once produced frustration or urgency from you now meets stillness. What once pulled you into explanation now meets restraint. And that restraint becomes something they cannot easily interpret. This is where manipulation begins to lose its language. It is not that the words stop being spoken, or the behaviors stop appearing, but rather that they no longer translate into influence. The emotional meaning they once carried no longer lands in the same place within you. You begin to hear things without absorbing them in the same way. You begin to see intentions more clearly without being pulled into their emotional framing. And in that clarity, you start responding differently, not from reaction, but from observation, not from urgency, but from understanding. You no longer feel the need to rush into defending your perspective every time it is challenged. Instead, you begin to allow silence to do part of the work that words once tried to do alone. Because silence, when used consciously, does not accept distortion. It simply refuses to engage with it. Over time, this refusal becomes a form of quiet authority. Not authority that demands recognition, but authority that is felt in the absence of compliance. People who once expected predictable emotional responses begin to realize that those responses are no longer available in the same way. And without those responses, the patterns that relied on them begin to dissolve. What remains is not conflict, but clarity. A clarity that comes from no longer negotiating your sense of self within systems that require you to shrink, over-explain, or constantly adjust your reality for the comfort of others. You begin to stand in a steadier version of yourself, where understanding is no longer something you beg for, but something you discern. And in that discernment, manipulation does not end in drama or confrontation. It ends quietly because it no longer has a language that you are willing to speak back to. Respect that is built on fear is fragile because fear itself is unstable. It may create obedience for a moment, but it never creates understanding, and anything that is not understood cannot last in its depth. When people are afraid, they may adjust their behavior, but they do not transform their perception. They are responding to pressure, not recognition. And pressure always has an expiration point. So what appears as respect in fearful environments is often only silence under tension, not true acknowledgement of worth. Self-possession changes this entirely. When a person is rooted in themselves, they are no longer negotiating their identity based on how others react to them. They are not shifting their tone to be accepted, nor shrinking their presence to be tolerated. Instead, they carry a steadiness that does not depend on external approval. This steadiness becomes noticeable even to those who do not fully understand it. It is not loud, but it is consistent. It does not demand space, but it does not lose it either. There is a quiet authority in someone who is not easily unsettled. It is not the authority of control over others, but control over oneself. That is the form of strength that cannot be easily manipulated because it is not reactive. It does not rise and fall with every opinion, every accusation, or every attempt to provoke. Instead, it remains anchored. And that anchoring creates a kind of presence that people begin to recognize over time, even if they cannot explain why. Fear-based dynamics often rely on emotional imbalance. They depend on the idea that someone can be pushed into reaction, and that reaction will confirm influence. But self-possession interrupts that expectation. When there is no emotional collapse to witness, no defensive overreaction to exploit, and no visible instability to feed on, the entire structure loses its effectiveness. What remains is a situation that no longer responds in the way it used to. In that space, respect begins to take a different shape. It is no longer extracted through pressure or intimidation. It begins to form through observation. People start to notice consistency where there used to be volatility. They notice restraint where there used to be emotional overflow. And in that noticing, something shifts internally. They begin to adjust, not because they are forced to, but because they recognize something they cannot easily disrupt. Self-possession does not mean silence in every situation, nor does it mean absence of emotion. It means emotion is no longer driving every response. There is a pause between feeling and action, and in that pause, choice exists. That choice is where dignity lives. Because dignity is not about controlling others. It is about not being controlled by circumstances that seek to pull you away from your center. Over time, this way of being speaks louder than any attempt at dominance ever could. It does not need to prove itself because it is already expressed in how consistently you remain aligned with who you are. And in that alignment, respect is no longer something that must be demanded. It becomes something that naturally follows presence, that is no longer willing to abandon itself for approval or fear. There is a kind of boundary that does not need to be spoken aloud, because it is already communicated through presence alone. It is not drawn with anger, nor enforced with aggression, nor explained repeatedly to be understood. It is simply lived. When calmness becomes your response instead of reaction, you begin to embody a boundary that cannot be easily crossed. Not because others are afraid to cross it, but because they realize there is nothing there for them to disrupt anymore. Provocation depends on access. It depends on finding a point inside you that still reacts in predictable ways. For a long time, that access may have been easy for others to find. Through words that unsettle you, situations that pressure you, or patterns that pull you into emotional urgency. But when you begin to observe instead of absorb, that access slowly closes, not with force, but with awareness. And in that awareness, you start noticing that not everything said to you requires entry into your inner world. Calmness, when it is rooted deeply, does not mean the absence of feeling. It means feeling without being overrun by it. It means you can experience discomfort, disagreement, or misunderstanding without immediately turning it into conflict or collapse. This is where the real boundary forms, not in pushing others away, but in no longer pulling yourself into every disturbance that appears around you. There is something disarming about a person who does not react on demand. Where there was once expectation of emotional response, there is now stillness. Where there was once predictability, there is now space. And that space changes the entire dynamic, because what once relied on urgency now meets pause. And in that pause, control begins to lose its shape. The world often teaches that strength is loud, that boundaries must be enforced through intensity, and that silence means surrender. But lived experience reveals something different. The most unshakable boundary is not the one that constantly has to be defended, but the one that does not need to be tested repeatedly because it does not offer instability as an entry point. When calmness becomes your default state, provocation begins to lose its reward. There is no emotional reaction to extract, no chaos to amplify, no breakdown to witness. And without those elements, the attempt itself starts to feel empty. Not because you are resisting it in a visible way, but because you are no longer participating in the emotional exchange it depends on. Over time, this changes how you are approached. Not everyone understands it immediately, but they feel it. They begin to sense that certain behaviors no longer reach you the way they used to, and in that realization, something shifts in their own approach. Some step back, not out of fear, but out of recognition that the old patterns no longer fit. Others adjust. without even realizing why. And you remain there, not distant, not detached in an absent sense, but centered, present yet not easily pulled, open yet not easily disrupted, because the strongest boundary is not the one that blocks everything out, but the one that remains calm enough within itself that nothing outside can easily turn it into chaos. There is a strange truth about chaos. It does not exist on its own for long. It survives through participation. It grows when it is fed with attention, reaction, emotion, and constant engagement. Without that fuel, chaos begins to lose its shape. It does not disappear in an instant, but it weakens gradually, as if it is searching for something familiar to hold on to and finding nothing. When you begin to cultivate inner peace, something subtle shifts in how chaos interacts with you. The same situations may still arise, the same voices may still speak, and the same attempts to provoke may still appear, but your relationship to them changes. You are no longer stepping into them in the same way. You are no longer allowing them to define your emotional state. And without that participation, what once felt overwhelming begins to feel distant. Those who thrive on emotional turbulence often depend on a certain rhythm. They expect a reaction, then a counter-reaction, then escalation, then emotional exhaustion. It is a cycle that feeds itself through constant engagement. But inner peace disrupts that rhythm. It does not argue with it. It does not try to overpower it. It simply refuses to dance along with it. And in that refusal, the cycle begins to lose momentum. At first, this can create confusion in others. Where there was once predictable emotional response, there is now calm. Where there was once engagement, there is now space. And space is difficult to control because it does not provide resistance or reinforcement. It simply exists, unchanged by the intensity around it. For those accustomed to chaos, this absence of reaction can feel unfamiliar, even unsettling, because it removes the feedback they are used to receiving. But inner peace is not passive. It is deeply active in a quiet way. It requires awareness, restraint, and a continuous choice not to be pulled into what does not align with your inner stability. It is not about pretending things do not affect you. It is about choosing not to let those effects dictate your direction. That distinction is what transforms peace from a temporary state into a grounded way of being. Over time, chaos begins to lose its influence over those who no longer feed it, not because chaos itself has changed, but because the source of its reinforcement has shifted. The emotional reactions that once gave it momentum are no longer as available. And without that momentum, what remains is often just noise without impact, movement without direction. Inner peace also changes how you interpret situations. What once felt urgent may now appear less significant. What once demanded immediate response may now be observed with clarity before any action is taken. This pause is not hesitation, it is awareness. And awareness creates distance between stimulus and response, allowing you to choose rather than react. In this space, you begin to notice something important. Not every disturbance deserves your attention, and not every emotional wave requires you to be pulled into its depth. And as you continue to remain steady, even in the presence of chaos, something quiet but undeniable happens. It begins to fade, not because it has been defeated, but because it is no longer being sustained by you. There is a deeper intelligence in restraint that most people only begin to understand after they have spent enough time inside unnecessary conflict. At first, it feels natural to respond in the same tone you are spoken to match intensity with intensity, to believe that equal force is the only way to be understood. But experience slowly reveals something different. What you fight with equal fire does not settle, it only spreads. There is a moment when you begin to see that not every flame deserves your effort to extinguish it. Some fires are not yours to carry. Some situations are designed in a way that they grow stronger every time they are acknowledged with anger, urgency, or emotional escalation. And so when you step into that awareness, your response begins to change. You stop rushing into the heat. You start observing it first. Letting fire burn itself out is not indifference. It is discernment. It is the understanding that energy, when not fed, eventually collapses under its own weight. Conflict that depends on reaction cannot survive in the absence of reaction. It begins to lose its direction, its momentum, and eventually its purpose. What once demanded your full emotional participation begins to reveal that it cannot sustain itself without your involvement. This is where strength takes on a quieter form, not the kind of strength that pushes harder, but the kind that steps back with clarity. It is not avoidance, it is choice, a choice to no longer invest your inner peace into cycles that do not lead anywhere except exhaustion. And in that choice, something powerful happens. You are no longer inside the fire. You are observing it from a distance that keeps you intact. At this distance, you begin to notice how much of conflict is maintained through repetition. The same patterns, the same triggers, the same emotional hooks appear again and again, waiting for the same familiar response. But when that response no longer arrives, the pattern begins to lose confidence. It does not escalate forever. It cannot. It requires participation to continue, and without participation, it starts to weaken. There is a quiet dignity in refusing to escalate what was never meant to be balanced through aggression, because not every situation is solved by matching energy. Some situations are dissolved by withdrawing from the need to match anything at all. In that withdrawal, clarity enters. And clarity does what anger cannot. It reveals what is actually happening beneath the surface. You begin to see that much of what once felt like urgency was actually noise. And noise loses power when it is no longer interpreted as something that must be answered immediately. You give it space, and in that space, it begins to collapse into itself, not because you destroyed it, but because you stopped sustaining it. And in this understanding, something shifts within you permanently. You no longer feel obligated to turn every spark into a battle. You recognize that peace is not maintained by constant resistance, but by selective engagement. And sometimes, the most powerful response you can give to fire is not more fire, but distance, patience, and the quiet certainty that what cannot sustain itself will eventually fade on its own.